Today for our meeting with GFO slash Portland Ice Dog, I'm really pleased that we have Bennett Greenspan joining us. Bennett has been the founder of Family Tree DNA, as most of you know, and has been influential in the entire genealogy arena for many, many years. And I've appreciated my relationship with Bennett for the many years that I've gone to the Family Tree DNA conferences and other interactions that Bennett and I have had at other meetings and other venues. So without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and let Bennett make a few introductory comments if he has any, and then we're going to go into some additional questions that Ben and I have talked about.
Well, Tim, it's nice to see you, and to all the participants today. It's great to see your thumbnails. It's been a long time since I've spoken to a group, since I retired a few years ago. And Tim, kind of pushed me a little bit to come on this presentation. But now that I'm here, I'm very excited to engaging with y'all. So thank you, Tim, and thank you to the group for hosting and having me.
All right. Well, let's just jump into our first question here today, Bennett. These are just kind of an introductory question. So why don't you tell us just a little bit about how you got interested in family tree research and genealogy in general, and kind of what sparked your interest in this entire topic?
Well, I grew up in Omaha, Nebraska, where I didn't have any first cousins. Might have had some old second cousins. More likely, I had some third cousins and fourth cousins. And I kind of felt isolated. I had one grandparent that lived in Omaha. My other grandparents lived in Minneapolis. And so I always had this feeling that I was missing some family. And when my grandmother died just before I turned 13, that night people came over to the house to pay their condolences to my mother and her sister. And I was the little kid going from old person to old person, asking them to tell me about their family. Most of them had accents. I asked when they came over and how many siblings they had, and I drew my first family tree that day. In fact, when I make presentations, or when I had made presentations in the past, I still have that genealogy chart from the mid 1960s. And so always I've been interested in genealogy. It turns out our family knew practically nothing about my great-grandfather Greenspan, because he died in the United States of tuberculosis and was buried in a pauper's grave in New York in 1904. And so again, I always felt isolated. And even though that's a line that I tried to work on, I never had any success because there wasn't anyone that had any information to share. On the other side of the family, I had lots of relatives in Omaha who were happy to share their genealogical memories with me. And so that got me interested and excited in the 1960s. But I quickly found out what a paper trail roadblock was, Tim. And when I ran into a paper trail roadblock, my reaction was to put down my genealogy and to go do something else. And so I picked up and put down and picked up and put down my genealogy in the 60s, one short stint in the 80s. And then after I sold my photographic supply company in the late 1990s, I had the time and the opportunity to get involved in doing more genealogical research as an adult rather than as an interested teenager.
Thanks for that background. How good was your initial family tree? How far were you able to take your tree back based on all those interviews and things like that that you had at that point?
So, Tim, I was able to take it back a few generations. I did have one relative that we estimated was born probably in the late 1700s, 1790s. And then a couple of the relatives who were born in the early 1800s, a couple of them who had actually were born in the early 1800s who came to the United States in their 70s. In fact, it's kind of interesting. When we went to the cemetery for the burial of my grandmother in 1965, after the ceremony was over, my dad took my hand and my mother took my brother's hand, and they walked around in that cemetery. And that day I realized that even though I didn't have a lot of relatives in Omaha, Nebraska, I had a lot of deceased relatives in Omaha, Nebraska, right in that cemetery, just lined up waiting for a genealogist to come and exhume, so to speak, information. Although most of that information I had gotten from from the relatives that night in 1965. On a few lines, I was able to get back, into as I said, into the early 1800s. Most of them were just the late 1800s or early 1900s. So it was nothing, to be particularly proud of as a genealogist, but it was my history, which made it interesting. Of course, to me, one of the hallmarks of genealogy and why we're so passionate about it, because we have an opportunity to look at ourselves rather than something abstract.
I completely agree. And I think no matter how far you can trace your family tree back, it's very personal. Our family trees are very personal. Every time we make a new discovery on our family tree, it means something to us personally, whether that's an ancestor who lived in the 1600s or an ancestor who lived just 3 or 4 generations back. So, and we all have different abilities to trace our trees depending on what records were preserved and what our backgrounds were and things along those lines. Bennett, now can you talk a little bit about your interest in genetic genealogy? We all remember when Thomas Jefferson's study came out, and basically we learned that he fathered a child through Sally Hemings. And that was one of my first introductions into genetic genealogy. And you also were aware of that study, and then you started interacting with Dr. Hammer. So maybe why don't you tell us a little bit about how you kind of got connected into genetic genealogy and what that initial foray was like, and maybe just reminisce with us a little bit about your call with Dr. Hammer.
Okay. Well, let me first share the motivation for me picking up my genealogy again in the late 1990s. I owned what was called a photographic supply company. That's 35 millimeter film, sheet film for newspapers, advertising agencies. And in the mid 1990s, I saw the digitization of an analog industry and knew that it was going to put that business out of business. So I sold the company in 1997. I worked for them for the longest 17 months of my life. And then eventually in 1998, I quit.
Today for our meeting with GFO / Portland Ice Dog, I'm really pleased that we have Bennett Greenspan joining us. Bennett has been the founder of Family Tree DNA, as most of you know, and has been influential in the entire genetic genealogy arena for many, many years. I've appreciated my relationship with Bennett for the many years that I've gone to the Family Tree DNA conferences and other interactions that Bennett and I have had at other meetings and other venues. So without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and let Bennett make a few introductory comments if he has any, and then we're going to go into some additional questions that Ben and I have talked about.
Well, Tim, it's nice to see you, and to all the participants today. It's great to see your thumbnails. It's been a long time since I've spoken to a group, since I retired a few years ago, and Tim, kind of pushed me a little bit to come on this presentation. But now that I'm here, I'm very excited to engaging with y'all. So thank you, Tim, and thank you to the group for hosting and having me.
All right, well, let's just jump into our first question here today, Bennett. These are kind of an introductory question. So why don't you tell us just a little bit about how you got interested in family tree research and genealogy in general, and kind of what sparked your interest in this entire topic?
Well, I grew up in Omaha, Nebraska, where I didn't have any first cousins. Might have had some old second cousins. More likely, I had some third cousins and fourth cousins. And I kind of felt isolated. I had one grandparent that lived in Omaha. My other grandparents lived in Minneapolis. And so I always had this feeling that I was missing some family. And when my grandmother died just before I turned 13, that night, people came over to the house to pay their condolences to my mother and her sister. And I was the little kid going from old person to old person, asking them to tell me about their family. Most of them had accents. I asked them when they came over and how many siblings they had. And I drew my first family tree that day. In fact, when I make presentations, or when I had made presentations in the past, I still have that genealogy chart from the mid 1960s. And so always I've been interested in genealogy. It turns out our family knew practically nothing about my great-grandfather Greenspan because he died in the United States of tuberculosis and was buried in a pauper's grave in New York in 1904. And pretty much I was at home. Maybe I was getting in my wife's way. I was certainly trying to be helpful. One day, my wife came home and she asked me to take the groceries out of the car, which of course I did. And then I asked her, can I put the groceries, on the countertop? And she said, sure. After I had done that, I said, would you like me to put the groceries away in the cupboard? She said, sure. And I opened up the cupboard and I found the whole peeled tomatoes on one shelf and spaghetti sauce on another shelf and spaghetti on another shelf. And I said, dear, would you like me to reorganize your cupboard? Men, that is not a smart thing to say to your wife. I found out that day. My wife looked at me, I like to say, as only a loving, adorning wife can. And she pointed at me. I don't like that. And she said, you need to learn how to play golf, or you need to go back to your genealogy, but you need to get the hell out of my kitchen. And so, kind of, so to speak, tail between legs, I said to her, and I selected one lineage that of my 8 great-grandparents that I had never done any research on. And so I spent the next 6 weeks and reconstructed from the immigrant ancestor to the 6 children, of which my grandmother was one. And basically, I drew a family tree, included everybody on it, started sending copies of a Kinko's 11 by 17 of the family tree out to relatives who were good enough to share their address with me. And I was pretty pleased, at which point I entered the name into a database, and I found someone with the same surname from Buenos Aires who was searching and claimed that her great-grandfather, she was a generation younger than me, that her great-grandfather had come from the same village that my grandmother was born in. So I looked at their names. We had some name overlaps. We had some city overlaps. And I was just convinced, like any, good, hopeful genealogist will be, that I had really found family. But I didn't have proof. I didn't have that piece of evidence that linked them together. And of course, every genealogist knows that one of those things is speculation and one of those is confirmation. And I wanted confirmation, Tim. So I didn't know how to solve my problem. I thought about it. And one night, in August of 1999, I went out walking the dog late at night, thinking about my problem. And I remembered the Kohanim study from 1997. I remembered the Jefferson study from 1998. And when I got home that night after walking the dog, I started doing internet searches. I found that there was only one professor who was an American from those 2 studies, the Kohanim and the Jefferson study. And so the next morning I got up, and due to the power of what was at that time 1411.com, I was able to look up the phone number of this guy, Professor Michael Hammer from the University of Arizona, and I just brazenly gave him a call. His wife answered the phone and said that he's leaving shortly for the airport. He's going to speak in Spain, but that she would try to get him. And he came on the phone, not very interested. And that's the nicest way of putting it. Bored would be another way to put it. And I asked him, I said, look, I just want to buy a couple of DNA kits. And he said, well, we don't sell DNA kits to the general public. because we only do it for anthropological purposes. And I said, well, will this work? Would it actually prove that two people that have the same last name but don't have evidence linking them together, would it actually work and show that they were related? And he said, yes, it should work just fine. And I didn't know what to do, because he had told me no, even though he had the ability to run tests. He didn't run them for genealogical purposes. And then I did something that I learned in sales school maybe 40 years ago. Sometimes it's better to just and let the other person say something. And that's what he did. After probably 10, 12 seconds of an eerie quiet on the phone, he said, someone should start a company like this, because I get phone calls from crazy genealogists like you all the time. At which point all the light bulbs went off, a smile came to my face, and I said, look, Dr. Hammer, I know you're very busy. I'm going to write a business plan this weekend and tell you what I would do if I had the opportunity to run a company that was doing DNA tests for confirmation purposes for genealogists. And it took us about 3 months after he came back from Spain before he was able to get Arizona Research Labs to agree that they would treat Family Tree DNA as a retail customer. We would be the public face of genetic genealogy. They wanted no phone calls. They wanted no contact with the general public at all at the University of Arizona. So we had to take over that responsibility, but they would do the laboratory work and make sure that, that everything worked from a scientific standpoint. So, in probably April of 2000, I started telling people what we were doing and started taking some of the leads that Hammer had gotten. These are emails from people who had read the Kohanim article and then had sent interest letters to Hammer that he had never responded to. And he simply gave me 20 or 30 emails of people that had contacted him anywhere from a few months to a year and a half earlier. And since they had phone numbers on them, I simply was calling them up on behalf of Hammer, telling them that these tests were now available if they were interested. And a couple people actually were interested enough that they ordered. And at that point, I thought we may have something really, really viable here.
That was 1998 now, is that right, Bennett?
No, that was late.
99.
That was 99. That was
99.
late 99. And
Okay.
and it took I wanted a proof of concept, because I'm not a scientist, Tim. I'm a business guy. And I said, look, Dr. Hammer, I'd like you to prove to me that this works. And so he said, sure. At which point now he sends me 24 kits and tells me to go on out and recruit 24 people. So I got my potential cousin in Argentina. I needed to get my cousin of the same last name in California. We got a couple people who had the same last name but didn't know they were related. We got a couple of twins. And basically, we just went out and grabbed people to see if, when we got the results back, if people who were not known to be related to each other were related, or could we actually use DNA as a discriminating tool to say you're not related and you are related. And when we got those results, it was pretty exciting, a little bit scary because two second cousins who should have matched didn't match. Yet at the same time, my NITS cousin in California matched the NITS down in Arizona. And then my son had gone to junior high school with a boy who had the same last name as a cousin of ours who had married into the family. I tested them. They matched each other. So we had a couple of a prioris that led to a match, but we had one in the second cousins who didn't match. And so we had the opportunity right from the very beginning, Tim, to see the good and the ugly. the
Mhm.
scare, the non-paternal event that that we're all so familiar with. Because I mean, that's why I like to say that if you really don't want to know the answer to the question, don't ask the question. Because you will
Exactly.
get an answer. It may not be the answer you want, and you may have to spend a lot of time explaining that answer to people, and it may be painful. So think before you rush in. But in general, if you're on a search for the truth, I found very, very quickly that DNA would give you truthful answers, even if they might be a little unsettling. And so that kind of shows, where I went from this emotional high that we're going to be able to do DNA testing, we're going to be able to answer these questions, all the way to the point that now we had a story that we really didn't want to talk about in that proof of concept. And then we had other examples in that proof of concept, which were absolutely wonderful. The people who didn't know they were related to each other because one came from Eastern Europe to the United States in 1990, the other one came in the 1890s. So their families were separated by 3, 4 generations, and all we had was a surname in common, but indeed they matched each other. They didn't match anyone else. So that really gave me an idea of what we were going to be able to do. And as soon as I saw those results, I knew that every genealogist worth their salt was going to want to get a piece of this, because it offered the opportunity to answer questions when otherwise we just had speculation. And so as a confirmational tool, it offered a lot of opportunity to flailing genealogists.
Absolutely. And that was for 12 marker tests back then. And you started that out at your garage, as I recall. Max and you, and I think you told me you had one other partner too. So maybe tell us a little bit how that all kind of developed in the first year or two.
So actually, it wasn't the garage; it was the bedroom.
Mm-hmm.
And the computer was in the bedroom where I printed off certificates. My wife was making kits in the bedroom, or in the kitchen table, or in the carpool line, because she didn't want to waste any time. And I can get those 5 kits that we sold this week. I can get those made in the carpool line, and she did. What happened was we started selling some kits with just word of mouth, 100% word of mouth, that you would do a test and you would find it interesting, and you'd be talking to a friend of yours, and I would end up getting a phone call. And this was the office phone. It was my personal cell phone. And so, I figured if I'm going to be the face of genetic genealogy, my phone might also end up being its own face to genetic genealogy. Originally, I had a doctor who was a partner, who was my personal MD. His brother was a geneticist. And it just so happened that the night that I spoke to Hammer in the morning, we were going out to dinner with he and his wife that evening. And I spoke about it. Next day, we talked to his brother, the geneticist, and it just seemed like he would be an appropriate person to partner up with. And he was a partner for a while, but shortly thereafter, I recognized that we were going to have to scale. We were going to have to uh, being able to sell 5 kits a week to 50 kits a week. And my partner, Max, who's my partner in other businesses also, was really a perfect person to do that, because his mentality works very well with scaling opportunities. And so Max was my first real active partner. The doctor wasn't an active partner. I like to say that he was there on Saturdays when we counted the kits that had come in for the week, but he wasn't there any other time. But he was still a partner, and he and his brother in particular were able to give us some advice, which was very helpful in those first couple years.
Mm-hmm. Then you expanded into 25, then to 37 markers, and eventually got more markers. And then, of course, you developed also the mitochondrial DNA line. Tell us a little bit of how the testing evolved and how you developed your lab and some of those kind of things?
Well, first of all, let me say that that all the work was done at the University of Arizona for the first several years, with them doing the lab portion and us doing the front end. But what we found out is that in general, it can be a little dicey having a university as your production partner because they don't have the same kind of mentality of get the work done and that sense of urgency that my customers certainly had and voiced to us over the telephone, whenever they felt appropriate. But we did well enough to create a reputation such that in 2003, the National Geographic Society just wrote us an email just out of the blue. Max got an email one day claiming it was from the National Geographic Society and that they wanted to have a phone conversation with us to speak about doing DNA testing. And we made that phone call and we realized it was a real call. I mean, they were really serious about this and it shocked us. They invited us to come up to Washington, D.C., where Max and I went in January of 2004. To see the name National Geographic and Family Tree DNA on a slide presentation produced by the National Geographic Society, quite frankly, Tim, was thrilling. And so we worked for the next year or so to get ready for them to do a launch, which they did on April 15th, 2005. And I'll never forget, they sold 10,000 kits the first day, 30,000 kits the first month, and 110,000 kits the first year. And we thought it was going to be the end of the retail business for Family Tree DNA, that all of the business was going to go through National Geographic. And what we didn't realize is that National Geographic vindicated the idea, and our business, both our National Geographic business, grew, and our Family Tree DNA typical genealogy business continued to grow, really on the strength of the fact that National Geographic was doing something with this. Now, we started out with a 12 marker test, as you mentioned, but the market, our customers continually were telling us that they wanted more resolution. They wanted more discrimination power to be able to, to confirm, who of two or three cousins were most closely related to each other. And so we pushed the University of Arizona to bring out additional testing panels, which would offer our customers the opportunity to have a more discriminating test. And from a business standpoint, it offered us the opportunity to have an upgrade because unlike by that time our competitors, which was primarily relative genetics, of Arizona had convinced me that we should look at the business as if the DNA was a DNA testing and preservation service. And so we retained the DNA, and we in fact have DNA samples that we collected in April and May of 2000. And because of the secret sauce that we use with the swabs, we have on many occasions taken swabs that were 10 and 15 years old, and the success rate of being able to re-extract from a swab that's been swabbed, not extracted, that's been sitting in the lysis buffer for 10 or 15 years, the success rate has been over 90%. And
Right.
not understanding what we were doing, but simply following the dictates of a fellow named Matt Kaplan, who is Michael Hammer's brother-in-law. He said, why would you throw away this DNA? You can consider it inventory. And we had never really thought about it because, we come from the business side, not necessarily the lab side, but it made a lot of sense. We started doing it. There was a lot of discussion that needed to take place with customers. Some people were uncomfortable with the idea. Most people were very comfortable with the idea. We had a clear split between the way we did it by preserving and the way relative genetics did it by explicitly saying that they were not preserving anything and tossed it away. But ultimately, I think that history has proven that the preservation of the DNA by someone who has the honesty and the credibility to use it for nothing but something that the customer was paying us for really, really paid off.
That's great. And then kind of bring us up to the autosomal development. 23andMe kind of initiated that. And then you got into it within the next year after that. You had a few snafus with the initial testing chip, and then you retested things. Maybe summarize kind of how things went in the autosomal area.
Tim, you have a wonderful memory. And you just reminded me of something that I could share. Well, first of all, we started in 2000 with the Y chromosome. And at the same time, Dr. Brian Sykes in England started with mitochondria. When he saw what we were doing with the Y chromosome, he stopped his implementation of a Y chromosome sale because he was only going to offer 4 markers. He beefed up his panel and came out about a year later with a 10 marker panel while we had the Y12. And we also brought out HVR1, the hypervariable region number 1 on mitochondria, which was what he was doing. And ultimately, we brought out the second hypervariable region again for more resolution. But if you want to fast forward to about, we understood that there was this company that had just started called 23andMe. They weren't really out of their stealth phase, but we had heard about them. And we reached out to them. And in fact, Max and I got on an airplane, went up to San Francisco and met with Annie and her partner at the time. And they assured us that they were not interested in genealogy at all. They were only interested in the medical aspects of what could be done with their DNA test, and that it was going to be priced in such a way that would only be for medical purposes and not really for genealogy purposes. What they didn't tell us is that they were going to throw a few potential genealogical snips on the chip so that it would have a broader appeal. And then about a year after they brought out their test, they figured out that they could take chunks of autosomal DNA and make comparisons with them, and they could break through the sexual barrier that was the liability for using the Y chromosome or the mitochondria. And so that started gaining ground in 2009. I remember having a heart-to-heart conversation with a member of the community who said, Bennett, the bloom is off your rose. The interest right now is on autosomal because having to find a woman's father's brother's son was not that easy all the time. A lot of lineages were daughtered out, Tim, and the autosomal allowed us to pierce through that barrier, which is why now there was a product that wasn't restricted to father's father's father or mother's mother's mother, but there was a product that allowed everyone to play. And so when I finally understood that, I said to our science team, okay, you guys need to start perfecting the mathematics on this. We started out using a system from a company called Affymetrix. That's because our competitor, 23andMe, was using Illumina, and we didn't think that we were going to have the opportunity to get a fair shake or a level playing field, in that they had been very helpful to 23andMe getting operational. So we looked at the company that Illumina had broken off from, which was Affymetrix, and started working with them. And what we found is that their system wasn't nearly as forgiving as the technology that Illumina had. And so kind of right in the middle, where we had tested probably 8,000 samples, we decided that we were going to go with Illumina based on their higher, easier test. In other words, their test was more forgiving. The DNA quality didn't have to be as good, as pristine, and yet we could still get repeatable answers. And there's a lot of variability when you send out a swab to someone and say, scrape your mouth. Some people do it before they brush their teeth, some people after coffee, even though we would prefer that you do nothing for an hour beforehand. We realized we didn't have control over that. So we figured that we needed the most forgiving system possible. And so we then too purchased the Illumina system and retested everybody that had originally tested with us using the Affymetric system, so that we would have not only the same platform that 23 was using, but we would have all of our customers on the same platform. It just seemed like that was the right thing to do. And so that's what we did. And that put us into the autosomal business, which now became what I refer to as the third leg of the stool, because we had Y, we had mitochondria, and now we had autosomal.
Absolutely. And it's amazing how autosomal has really taken off. And from my standpoint, I mean, there's probably 40 to 50 million people now who've done autosomal DNA tests. And Ancestry, of course, is the leader right now in that. Family Tree DNA is still doing very well there as well. But it's fun. It's really amazing to see what we can do from that. Why don't you maybe tell us a little bit about what you've learned through all of this? You've developed this amazing company. You've pioneered in this arena, but you've made some personal discoveries too. So can you go into your own personal family stories of what you have been learning about your family tree with all of this?
So as I had mentioned earlier, the line that I was really interested in was my Greenspan line. Of course, if you're a Greenspan, everybody thinks they're related to Alan Greenspan. Everybody. I'm quite sure that I am not. In fact, I started offering free Y12 DNA tests to any person I found named Greenspan. And for years, whether it was the bellman at the hotel I stayed at in Tucson, or it was someone I ran into randomly, I was offering these DNA tests to these guys, and no one ever matched me. So even though I had tested over 65 men named Greenspan, Greenspun, Greenspoon, none of them matched me. And that was a little frustrating, as you can imagine. That was like, the cobbler whose kids don't have shoes. It was frustrating. And then I got lucky. Then Providence kind of shined down on me. So what had happened is I was asked to speak at an adoption congress where kids who were adopted had all kinds of people coming in to talk to them about how they might be able to get the records open in the particular state. And for those people who weren't interested in waiting, how they might use DNA. I was there for that. I made a little speech, had a booth out front, and a fellow comes up to me and says, my wife's here. She's speaking to she's a psychologist, and she's speaking to the adoptees, but our name used to be Greenspan until we changed it to Green. And I said, well, why don't you think about getting a DNA test? And he said, oh, I'm sure they're way, way, way too expensive. So I said, well, why don't you come back before this ends and maybe we'll negotiate a little bit. He came back the next morning with a certificate from the National Geographic Society. And he said, I don't need to do a DNA test. My brother already did. So I looked at the results and I said, well, this kind of looks interesting. It could be related. And I opened up the computer and I looked at all the Greenspans and realized that he was closer to me than any of the other Greenspans who had actually tested with us, which was pretty exciting. And then in subsequent years, I did the big Y test, not only on myself and my brother and my son, but I also did it on a Green who lives in New York City and his second cousin who lives in and that's when I found out that the family had interlined and somebody stayed in Scotland and the other part of the family came on to New York. Now, where my relative fits in with them, I had no idea. But what I found through big Y testing is that not only were these guys closer to me than any other Greenspans, but they were closer to me than anyone in the entire family tree DNA database. And that was very exciting. I have something I want to try to show. Okay. So most of us will say that Y12 tests are of no value because we have 25, we have 37, we have a 111. So 12s are of less value. But I found something that kind of takes that and turns that on its head a little bit. What I've been doing for the last year and a half is I've been reaching out to everyone who's on my Y12 list and encouraging them. Now, that doesn't mean I didn't reach out to the Y37s or Y67s, but all the way down to the lowest level of Y. And I encourage those people to do big Ys. Sometimes I subsidize, sometimes I totally subsidize their doing testing. But I can tell you now that 2/3 of the people on my Y12 list, which has 170 people at Family Tree DNA, that 2/3 of those, a fully 120 people, have now been big Y tested. And every single person, every one of those 120 people who have been tested goes back to this individual back here, if you can see it. That's J-L823, which formed about 200, maybe 250 CE. Every single person descends from that single individual. And I've learned a lot about my own personal history by doing that. Let me bring you down here.
That's a Leo Little snip, by the way, Bennett.
Yes, please go ahead.
I was just going to say that's a Leo Little snip. That's one of the early snips that Family Tree DNA discovered in the early testing.
That is absolutely true, because when Thomas Cron was doing the experimenting with the Walk the Y, of course, I was a candidate. And so one of the first 1,000 SNPs that we discovered at the Family Tree DNA lab, they all had the L in front of them, which stood for Leo Little. Of course, Leo was, I think, L1 in honor and memory of him. Now, if you look down here, you'll see myself, my brother, my son, and my brother. And we all descend from this J-FT1, which is a SNP that the three of us all share. What's interesting is that the Greens, who used to be Greenspans before they shortened their name, both in New York and in Scotland, this is the guy from Scotland and this is the guy from New York. And they are descendants of this particular SNP up here. So they're descended from that SNP, and I'm descended from that SNP. And we estimate that SNP arose around 1750. Now, what's interesting is that we have one more person, this Marvin Harold. He comes off of that same SNP, this Zia 1718, but he doesn't have the name Greenspan, whereas this family and this family had the name Greenspan. So my guess is that this guy was related to us a little bit before people in my part of Europe were required to take on surnames, and that these people are related after that event. What I started doing is I started attaching with a vengeance the geographical information for all these people. So I know that we are from the southern Ukraine, from the Crimean Peninsula. Marvin was from a little village about 20 south of Kiev. This Saul Braverman, who comes from a SNP one step back, the Saul Braverman comes from a village that is today right on the Polish-Ukrainian border, but it is about 80 miles north of Kiev. So the distance between this guy and this guy was like 100 miles. And then this fellow was a little bit to the south and east of Poland. And then I went back, I got lucky, and I had one more mutation up here. And this guy, Laszlo, which is a typical Hungarian name, and he would say that Hungarian was his native language, but he would also say that the family always lived in Slovakia. And so at this point, I feel that I've made a pretty strong case that in about 1450, right here, the family was living in Slovakia. They migrated into Poland or the Ukraine in the 1550 time period. By 1750, they had moved further south in the Ukraine. And so, because of this, I feel that I have a pretty good argument that I know our approximate geographies probably back to the 1400s. That's why I am so zealously testing every single person who's willing to do it, because that will either give me more evidence, or it will disprove, my theory. Now, I can go back from this particular SNP that was found in Slovakia, and it goes back to this SNP. And this particular individual had my line, two other lineages, and then I've got all the people here. Well, what all those people have in common is that they're all found in Eastern Europe. They're all found in Poland or Hungary or Slovakia or the Ukraine or Lithuania, every single one of them. And what's interesting is that when I go back further from my branch here, which is the 1400s, if I go back to its ancestral branch in the 1200s, or to its ancestral branch in the family tree DNA discover page, where it shows you your SNPs, you can go back SNP by SNP, and it tells you where those people tell us that they have lived. And what I found is that the further back in time I went, I started discovering that the family members were not all from Eastern Europe. When I got back to the 1200s, and in particular, when I got back to the 800s, I found that those people, that their ancestors had stayed in Germany. In other words, where's your oldest known ancestor from? He's from Germany. And so what I'm seeing is a migration of my family from Germany into Slovakia, into Poland, into Ukraine. So I see a from west to east migration pattern. And what's particularly interesting is that when I come to J-L823, the SNP that is our first, I would say, relevant SNP in the 200s, that about half of the people are descended or have descendants living in Central and Eastern Europe, and the other half are living in Spain. And that was kind of a shock to me. What it means is that in all likelihood, my ancestors were living in Spain in the 200 time period, even though the prior SNPs, that if you go back on the J line, they're all found in the Middle East. But this guy jumped out of the Middle East and ended up in Spain. And I can come down to the second son, which is way down here. And I find that with that second son, I start to see Spain or Mexico, Spain or Mexico. And again, here, Spain or Mexico. So I believe I descend from a Middle Eastern family that left the Middle East, went to Spain, lived in Spain a few hundreds of years, and then part of the family left and moved towards Central Europe. Part of the family remained in Spain, and in fact, many of them live in Spain or in New Mexico or in Mexico or in Chile or in Peru, and all have thought of themselves since the Inquisition as Spanish Catholics, where now when they scratch the surface a little bit, they're finding things that surprise them.
Yes.
So that's the story.
You were telling me also about the fact that the Visigoths basically had some influence probably on your ancestors as well, and then the Muslims, of course, invaded uh, Spain, and then you were able to kind of make some assumptions there that your ancestors probably left somewhere around maybe 500, 600 AD or
Correct.
so to kind of get out of underneath of an oppressive situation in what is now Spain.
Tim, what I've been doing is I've been reading a lot about the history of the various parts of the world wherever I have a snip and a likely geography. And what I found is that the Jewish community in Spain started there probably just shortly after Jesus, so in the first century CE. Our first snip shows that we were there in the second century. I also learned that when the Roman Empire had problems, they liked to solve their problems, and sometimes that involved taking people and uprooting them from where they lived and putting them somewhere where they would be less trouble. That's what the Romans did to the Visigoths, the Goths, the Alans, and the Vandals, who were all various tribes in southern Germany, and they moved them in the 300s to southern France and Spain. When the Roman Empire fell apart in the 400s, the Visigoths took over and became Christian. Within a couple of centuries, anti-Semitism had started up with them. And in about 600, they passed a law that said that Jews were not allowed to emigrate. So my guess is that probably right at that time or prior to it becoming illegal to leave Spain, that my ancestral line probably got out of Spain and went to France or ultimately Germany. Unfortunately, as you know, you can't do DNA testing in France. So whatever samples we might have gotten that might have survived, we don't have access to them, but we certainly can do DNA testing of Americans who are of French ancestry or of Americans who are of German ancestry. And so my guess is that if they weren't out of Spain by the time it became illegal to go, they were probably trapped in Spain for a century, because once the Muslims conquered Spain, seemingly a lot of Jews got jobs as administrators for the Muslims who came in the early 700s. And so my guess is that the lines that have people living in Spain or the New World today who are Catholics are probably ones who stayed in Spain and ultimately became Catholic and lived their lives for 500 or 1,000 years as Catholics until I came ringing on their door saying, I have a new theory about your ancestry that I'd like to share with you. But I've gone through this with our science team, gone through this with Dr. Hammer, and pretty much they tend to think this theory that I have is as good as any. But I'm going to keep pushing it as long as I can keep doing DNA testing. I'm going to keep pushing it because I think that there's history that can be yielded from those SNPs that we would not have necessarily thought about. But you've got to overlay time and history over the approximate SNP or mutation date. And by doing that, I think that we'll be able to produce something that allows us to know much more about our personal history going back much further in time than we've ever had the opportunity to do before.
Well, thanks, Bennett, for that fascinating summary. I think that many of us are doing similar discoveries with Big Y, and we find it fascinating and interesting. And maybe I'll ask you another kind of research topic, which is at what point do you think it'll be feasible to do sequencing of the entire Y? Right now, you're getting close to maybe 20 million or so base pairs, but of course, the Y chromosome is around 60 million base pairs long. Do you see a time when at some point family tree DNA will be able to sequence the entire Y chromosome?
So, yes, in answer to your question, but I don't think that the gain is going to be anything nearly like what we've already gotten. And that's because at least 20 million of those 60 million bases are really not usable. or seemingly not usable. Now, that may change when we can do read lengths of 5,000 or 10,000 base pairs, so that we can stretch past a long stretch of AC, 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 AC that may be 1,000 bases long. That is a very, very long and unimportant repeat. But there could be data. But I will tell you that going from Big Y 500 to Big Y 700, which added several million base pairs to what we were testing, it provided relatively little for existing customers who already had a phylogeny. And so I'm not expecting something earth-shattering when we switch to the long reads, but there's other benefits of long reads. You don't need to sequence as much, which means pricing can come down because you don't have to do 50 or 100 times coverage and looking for lineups that are 70 or 100 bases long. Once you have 2,000 or 5,000 read lengths, it'll be very clear to map those. And so you won't need to have nearly as much sequencing done to be able to know that you've got the right answer.
Okay, great. Maybe we can now go into kind of what you think has really happened and how genetic genealogy has changed the field of genealogy entirely. I think you alluded to this a little bit earlier on in the presentation, but maybe give a little bit more thought and perspective of where the world is now as compared to, say, 1997, before the Cohenine study and before the Jefferson study. Tell us how you think genetic genealogy has changed the face of genealogy over the last 25 years or so now that this has been available.
Right. Well, first of all, it's given us genealogists another way to prove the truth. Like, I had a relative, and his name was Asbel, and we got an email or a letter one day from some folks. This is in the late 1990s, from someone from Oklahoma, and he spelled his name Asbell. That was not the way we spelled our name, but we all know name spelling is not that important. But he was absolutely convinced that he was related to my uncle in Omaha, Nebraska. Absolutely convinced. And I said, it's real easy, because I contacted him in the early 2000s. I said, it's real easy to prove whether we're related or not. I mean, we can speculate, we can take our paper trail records, and we can torture the data until it confesses, so to speak. But the real answer to the question is, do these two men have a Y chromosome that looks the same, or are they not near to each other? And so we did a DNA test. I paid for a DNA test on the guy in Oklahoma, and I'd already done my uncle earlier, and they didn't match. And so we were able to put to rest that rumor, so to speak, that they were really pushing, that we're related. For sure we are. And it was just an opportunity to clearly get to the truth in the matter. Now, I used to say, Tim, that I thought people should do their genealogy and then they should do a DNA test. But my friend, before he passed, Bob McLaren, used to yell at me, telling me no, I was wrong, and that doing the genealogy first was wasting people's time if you didn't know where they were anchored. And so he said, that's why when I find a new McLaren, the first thing I do is say, you need to take a DNA test, and we will assign you to one of our McLaren groups, or you might be unassigned, but at least we'll know right away what direction we're heading in, so we won't waste any of our time. And at the risk of sounding like a charlatan that everyone should order a DNA test, I held off and continued to say for many years, no, you should do your genealogy first. But I recognize that they were right, that it can save a lot of time using an inexpensive DNA test to know that you're headed in the right direction or you're not headed in the right direction. And I would like to think that that's the most valuable contribution that genetic genealogy has made so far towards towards the hobby or towards the industry by giving us a, so to speak, that North Star of truth.
I completely agree. And I think that there are many people out there who've had to rearrange their family trees, either because the Y chromosome results weren't what they were expecting, or the autosomal results frequently weren't exactly what they were expecting. And so they had to kind of do additional research because the grandfather or great grandfather, or possibly even the parent that they had thought that they had, wasn't exactly their parent. So your situation with your two second cousins not matching each other is played out a lot throughout the genetic genealogy field. And so if people are going to be as unemotional as they can about it, if they want their biologic family tree, they need to trace that using a combination of all three of the major tests, which is, your Y chromosome, your mitochondrial, as well as your autosomal tests, and see where those test results lead you. So I'm in complete agreement with you about that. So Bennett, maybe let's talk a little bit about the future now of genetic genealogy. I kind of laid out some question there for you. Maybe you can kind of just give your perspective on where you think we're going over the next 10 to 20 years. And I suggest that you maybe hit on each of the four different types of DNA. Can you just give us a little bit of perspective about that?
So let me just say from the outset that I'm not going to talk about autosomal or X, because there are plenty of people who know a lot more and are a lot more vested in that than I have ever been. The Y chromosome, I think we're seeing that map out right now, and we'll see the same thing later in 2025 when Family Tree DNA releases their Discover Me for mitochondria that will look at the mitochondria in a more discriminating way, and it will also provide estimated dates in the same way that they're doing for Y chromosome. What I wanted to talk about was AI. I just want to broach the subject. I that most of us, including me, understand the impact that may offer us, for good or for bad. But I think that we're all going to learn that LLM means large language model, which is the core to AI. I can foresee a time when, let's just say, all the records that an Ancestry.com or a MyHeritage has can be unleashed, and you can have, or you will, I believe, be able to have AI drawing family trees based on a whole set of parameters that you as the genealogist instructed. And we're doing a lot of those things now, but we're doing them in effect, by hand. So we're doing them one by one by one. And I think that as that changes with the speed and the power of AI, I think that we have the likelihood of having fairly sophisticated, fairly broad family trees that can be drawn with references as their evidence. And I see that happening. I'd be surprised if it doesn't happen in kind of an impressive way, because, there's tons of records that can be loaded into a large language model and then can be interpreted. And I think that we have to recognize that AI is kind of like at a 1.0 or a 1.1. Remember, we're kind of like on model 15 on the iPhone right now over the last 15 years. And I think that as time goes on, I think that we're going to have some very impressive trees that the system is going to be able to develop for us. But like with anything in that technology, we, the gatekeepers of the information, are going to have to scrutinize like hell to make sure it's right. Because if you go into Chat GPT or a couple others and do a search, if you ask enough questions about family tree DNA, you will find that all kinds of people have been running and managing family tree DNA because that software has made a leap. In other words, he worked at the company for this period of time. It was close to when Max and Bennett sold it. So this guy is probably the new manager. Well, no, not at all. And so we have to be careful, very careful with this AI, but handled properly with enough guardrails, I think that it will be a great tool for vetting and confirming our genealogies, similar to what we're also doing with DNA now as we approach those genealogies to make sure, that they're accurate.
Right. Well, thanks for those insights. I don't know that I have too much to add myself, but I think we're certainly at the beginning of understanding all of the genealogical and genetic information that we have. We are far from having completely analyzed this. And particularly when it comes to endogamous groups and things like that, there's a lot of data. I think AI may help us sort some of those things out where endogamy is so challenging to kind of take apart and to figure out where bits of DNA came from. So it'll be very interesting to see how that unfolds over the next 10 to 20 years or even longer after that. So the last question I'd posed for you, Bennett, which was, where do you think genealogists should go now? What should we be doing that maybe we aren't doing, or maybe just reiterate what you think everyone should do to further their genealogical and genetic research?
Well, look, I don't have an interest in any DNA testing companies anymore, but I would tell you that I think that to build the scaffold that our genealogies will attach to, I think that the more people who do DNA testing, the better off we collectively are. And when I say that, I'm not just talking about autosomal. I'm talking about mitochondria and Y chromosome, because when our AI models are building something, it will know if it's on the mother's side. If these two people don't have the same mitochondria, it's going to know that there's an error. And so the more data that we can, in effect, provide, the greater the chances of quick or early success and accuracy. And I think that we're all certainly interested in that. I think that you'll notice that at the Roots Techs and at the other conventions, you're going to start having small and then larger demonstrations of what someone did by building a large language model and then ask the system to take that and to build them a rudimentary family tree. I would watch for that development very carefully.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you all for coming on. This was kind of a pleasure for me, since I really don't do much of this anymore, but I miss it. And I love I love the industry, the genealogy industry, the DNA portion of it, of course. But I just am glad that I was in the right place at the right time and wasn't intimidated by the word science or technology, and that I was able to have a small hand in making genealogy better for all of us.
So thanks, Bennett. I appreciate you being willing to come on today and speak to our group. I'll